China has appointed a new international trade negotiator following the outbreak of a devastating tariff war between Beijing and Washington.
To Donald Trump's trade war now, and China has called on the United States to cancel all tariffs after Washington announced exemptions for some consumer electronics.
President Xi Jinping on Friday urged the EU to join China in defending globalization and opposing unilateral acts of bullying.
Which brings us to Europe. They were bracing for a full-blown trade war, but then Trump hit the brakes. The tariffs are on hold for 90 days. So Europe is now in a limbo. They have 89 days to strategize. What is their game plan?
The European economy is one of the world's largest trading blocs and a major market force in its own right. However, recent developments have sparked concerns that China is flooding Europe with cheap goods, an apparent consequence of the ongoing tariff wars. Reports suggest that Beijing has begun diverting its surplus export capacity into the EU market in the form of low-cost goods, particularly in response to US tariffs. This surge has placed many European manufacturers and retailers on high alert. While some describe it as a deliberate Chinese dumping strategy, others warn that the situation could severely undermine Europe's industrial base. European countries uphold strict trade standards emphasizing quality, safety, and durability. China, in contrast, dominates global markets with mass production and low-cost exports. But Europe is no pushover. The question is, can the European Union withstand this wave of cheap Chinese imports? Or will Beijing hit a wall of resistance in the form of EU regulations? Let's break down the numbers, political background, and market dynamics fueling this growing trade tension. Trade imbalance. A growing concern. The trade volume between China and the European Union is a cornerstone of the global economy. Every year, goods worth hundreds of billions of euros move between the two giants. According to the latest data from Eurostat, from the fourth quarter of 2024 to the first quarter of 2025, EU imports from China rose by 6%, while EU exports to China declined by an average of 3%. While China has long been one of the EU's largest trading partners, the trade imbalance has worsened significantly since the United States began imposing high tariffs on Chinese products. In recent months, the share of Chinese textiles and consumer electronics in the European market has increased by nearly 10%, placing mounting pressure on domestic producers, especially in France, Germany, and Italy. The dumping debate. The issue of ultra-low pricing, commonly referred to as dumping, has caught the attention of European regulators. Dumping occurs when a country exports goods at prices lower than their domestic market value, often to gain market share by undercutting foreign competitors. Some British retailers argue that loopholes and tax exemptions, like minimal taxes on low-value parcels, give Chinese products an unfair advantage. They claim it's not just competition, it's unfair competition. As a result, calls for stricter regulations are growing. Why the shift to Europe? The situation can be summarized simply. China has enormous production capacity. When US tariffs made it costlier to sell in the American market, Chinese exporters began redirecting their surplus goods to Europe, a vast and wealthy market. This shift has raised suspicions of dumping, especially within the European Commission and among national economic ministries. European officials allege that China is deliberately selling at a loss in key sectors to drive out local competition. China, however, denies these claims, arguing that its price advantage stems from low production costs and efficient supply chains. Beijing also disputes the notion of a flood, calling it a natural adjustment in global trade flows post-pandemic. Sector-wide impact European businesses in industries like textiles, furniture, small household appliances, electronics, and toys have reported a noticeable impact. Some UK retailers told CNBC that products costing €105 in local stores can be bought from Chinese sellers for just €34, including shipping. How is this possible? Tax exemptions and lax inspections are part of the explanation, but when combined with suspected dumping, the issue becomes more serious. The European Commission is investigating and may soon introduce anti-dumping measures. What are anti-dumping measures? If EU authorities find evidence of dumping in a particular sector, they can impose additional duties on imports from China to level the playing field. Similar measures have already been applied in sectors like steel and solar panels. Now, the focus has shifted to textiles, electronics, toys, and even footwear. Naturally, these measures provoke strong reactions from Beijing, which accuses the EU of erecting trade barriers under the guise of fairness. Meanwhile, European ministers, particularly in Portugal, Spain, and Italy, are warning about declining competitiveness among local brands, especially in consumer goods. Small businesses trying to recover from the pandemic say they simply can't compete. At the same time, many European consumers welcome the cheaper prices amid inflation and shrinking purchasing power. This highlights a broader dilemma: protect local industries or ease pressure on consumers? A divided Europe. Within the EU, opinions vary. France and Germany are pushing for stricter action, especially in industrial sectors. However, Nordic and Eastern European countries are more flexible, often benefiting from cheap Chinese inputs for their own factories. The EU's complex decision-making process makes swift action difficult. Still, pressure from retailers and manufacturers may force the European Commission to act, potentially triggering a wave of new anti-dumping investigations and escalating trade tensions with Beijing. Strategic and geopolitical implications. Trade isn't the only dimension. Europe's relationship with China is already complicated by geopolitical concerns, including Beijing's growing alignment with Russia and ongoing human rights issues. The EU is also grappling with an energy crisis, high inflation, and the economic fallout from the war in Ukraine. Cheap Chinese goods may offer relief to consumers, but they could spell disaster for Europe's domestic producers. If dumping is confirmed, the long-term consequences may include job losses, industrial decline, and renewed inflation as local supply chains vanish. China, backed into a corner by US tariffs, is eager to retain access to Europe and is strengthening ties with Central and Eastern European countries through its Belt and Road Initiative. Some fear that if the EU enacts harsh trade measures, China may reduce investment in these regions, potentially driving a wedge between EU members. What's next? Data shows Chinese imports to Europe, particularly textiles, footwear, toys, electronics, and household goods, have surged by 12 to 15% over the last 6 months. Meanwhile, domestic production in some sectors has fallen by 5 to 7%. Even without outright dumping, this significant price gap is troubling. Industry groups and trade associations are urging EU officials to close tax loopholes, introduce protective tariffs, and support vulnerable producers, especially small workshops in Italy and Spain. There are even reports of behind-closed-door meetings at the European Commission discussing emergency actions. If tariffs are imposed, product prices could rise, worsening inflation and alienating consumers. China could also retaliate, affecting European exports, especially machinery and automotive goods, with Germany being particularly vulnerable. Conclusion. The long shadow of the US-China tariff war has now reached Europe. With China redirecting its export firepower toward the EU, and the EU struggling to protect its industries without alienating consumers or China itself, the stakes are high. If tensions escalate, Europe could find itself caught in a new trade war. Whether the EU enforces strong protections or takes a more conciliatory approach will shape the next phase of its economic and geopolitical relationship with Beijing. What do you think? Is the surge in Chinese goods a case of dumping or just market dynamics at work? Should the EU protect its producers at all costs or prioritize affordable goods for its citizens? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel